Good morning and welcome everybody to Energy Consumers Australia's Foresighting Forum 2021. My name is Dan Silkstone and I'm the Communications Director at ECA. I'll quickly run through how today is going to work and I'll be back at the end to wrap up, but we'll get you to the more interesting speakers as quickly as possible. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land here in Melbourne, and that each of us, wherever we are in Australia, is on Indigenous country. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging of those nations, and we offer a special welcome to any Indigenous people who are here with us today. In case you hadn't noticed, things are a little bit different this year. Instead of meeting in person in Sydney in February, more than 250 of us are joining today for the first of 3 linked webinars that together make up this year's forum. This change, of course, was made necessary by the pandemic that we're all living through, and that fact will be particularly clear to those of us who are in lockdown right now. It's meant that we've had to readjust our plans for how we run this webinar. The team bringing it to you can't all be in the same room today, and we ask that you bear with us and do our best to make sure that things run smoothly. This year, we've decided to lean into the disruption of COVID. If we were all in the same room, we figure that is what most of us will be talking about. So this is the first webinar in a series that will look at what we, as energy system participants and decision makers, can learn about the future from the shocks of the past 18 months. Not just COVID, but bushfires and economic shocks, storms and floods, and we've even had a mouse plague. Those shocks are certainly not over, and we know that in the future we can probably expect more of them. But we also know that they happen in the context of another big change, the energy transition we are all a part of. This first webinar takes the theme of social practice and consumer behaviour. We're talking about social practice as a series of common linked behaviours informed by values and norms and various other drivers. A bit of a different approach to the behavioural economics we are perhaps more used to, and that will be an important idea to discuss today. Our first speaker, Dr. Helen Rogers, is Director of Children and Family Surveys at the Australian Bureau of Statistics. She led the Household Impacts of COVID-19 survey as part of the Bureau's response to the emerging pandemic. Dr. Rogers will share with us how the ABS quickly identified that COVID-19 was going to be a major disruption to Australian life, and why they acted swiftly to make sure they were recording the responses of Australians to this defining event. Following that, we'll hear from Associate Professor Yolande Strengers and Dr. Kari Dahlgren from Monash University's Emerging Technologies Lab. Their world-leading digital energy futures research, which ECA is proud to support, looks at how home life is changing as new technology and new circumstances emerge, and what this might mean for the future energy system. So we'll start off with COVID, the big change that showed we needed to recalibrate what we think of as possible. And we'll move on to a team of researchers who are working hard to explore what the coming future might look like by talking to consumers and identifying key trends. We'll be asking, what can we learn by engaging with consumers around their social practice and changing behaviours? But also, what are the dangers and the limitations of our decision-making if we don't? Following that, we'll move on to a panel discussion that will be facilitated by our CEO, Lynne Gallagher, prompted by questions, hopefully great questions from all of you. On the screen in front of you, you'll notice there's a Q&A button and a button marked chat, just in the middle there. For the purposes of today, we'd ask that you keep all your responses, questions or comments to the Q&A area. We are not using the chat button today. We'll start off with a focusing question, just to keep your minds ticking over as you absorb what today's panelists have to say. Think about your part of the energy system, your organisation or your role. Where are the evidence gaps that limit your understanding of consumer behaviour and social practice? Place your answer in the Q&A function, and we'll discuss some of these a little later. We'll also collate your responses and share them back with you later as a blog post. We'll be live tweeting the event here today, and we encourage you to share your thoughts via Twitter if that's your thing. Our hashtag today is TakeCharge21, very active. And now I'd like to welcome from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Dr. Helen Rogers.
Thank you, Daniel. I would like to begin first by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people. They're the traditional owners, custodians of the land in Canberra from which I am joining you today. Also like to acknowledge as well the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you are sitting today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I'm going to talk to you today about how the Australian Bureau of Statistics went about collecting data to measure the impacts of COVID-19. Go to the next slide. From late February, we realised that there was going to be a strong demand from the community and government for additional data in relation to COVID and its impact on both people across Australia and businesses. We're in a unique position to provide enormous value by collecting and publishing near real-time information about how individuals and businesses were responding to the rapidly changing circumstances. So we knew we needed to go beyond our business as usual approach, and we worked closely with stakeholders to design questions, survey items for our new publications. Move on to the next slide. We introduced a lot of new products. By the end of August in 2020, we had 28 new products and 83 releases, including 2 new quick surveys. We also accelerated exploration of new data sources, and we collaborated with stakeholders and a statistical community to navigate methodological and data collection challenges that arose. To do this, we had to pause some elements of our planned forward work program, and we did this in consultation with our stakeholders again. Other elements naturally paused themselves. For instance, the ABS has a large face-to-face workforce, and that was quickly put on hold as we pivoted to measure aspects of COVID. The next slide. First, I want to mention 2 of our first products to be released were the 2 COVID, what we called rapid surveys. They were designed to collect near real-time information and responses from households and businesses to the pandemic. They were small surveys of about 1,000 participants in each. We were analysing the results within days and then publishing the results within 1 or 2 weeks. We were working with other departments such as Prime Minister and Cabinet, Treasury, and the Reserve Bank and Health Department, and other stakeholders to refine the questions and keep up to date with what was needed. The Household Impacts of COVID survey, which is the one I was running, provided information about things such as changes in job status, stimulus packages, personal and household stresses, concerns about physical and mental health, precautions people were taking, lifestyle changes, and more. The Business Impacts of COVID survey providing insights into the prevalence and nature of impacts of COVID on businesses operating in Australia, and topics such as workforce, operation, and impact of support measures. Other new products included weekly payroll and jobs and wages in Australia. This was extracting high frequency information from the single touch payroll system that businesses report to the Australian Taxation Office, which is information about wages, superannuation, tax payments for their employees. We had been looking at this earlier, but the arrival of COVID accelerated our analysis of this into providing weekly reports and a weekly publication. Another new set of COVID products was the range of preliminary and provisional data. It's not something that we traditionally had done, but we published this so that people could use it in a timely fashion with the understanding that there may be updates at a later stage. Next slide. I'm going to tell you, provide you a few examples of some of the things we found in the Household Impacts of COVID survey. But before that, this slide presents a bit of a context and a reminder of what was happening in 2020. We did our first survey in March 2020. And at that stage, we had about 1,000 people, which enabled us to do national estimates of things that were happening. And a reminder, during this initial lockdown, at the end of March, start of April last year, most states and territories had the same restrictions. So having national estimates proved to be okay. The restrictions began to ease from about mid-May. About mid-June, Victoria had another lockdown, and from September, we got a new survey sample. By that stage, we realised that national estimates only was not meeting everyone's needs. So we had our second sample was a larger sample that enabled some state and territory breakdowns. Restrictions in Victoria, for those in Victoria probably remember, began to ease in mid-October last year. And in December, New South Wales had a Northern Beach cluster and had strong but area-based restrictions. In February this year, Victoria had another 5-day lockdown. Now that's a bit of context to the data that I'm going to present over the next few slides. Go to the next slide. Yep. This first slide is about keeping physical distance from other people. We measured precautions taken over the last week, and we asked this every few months from September. Keeping a distance from others included things such as avoiding handshakes and hugs. You could see people in Victoria were more cautious and to stop taking this precaution. And after the Northern Beach cluster in December, people in New South Wales stayed a little bit more cautious in January, but then continued to ease up as precautions and restrictions eased. You can see by March this year, both New South Wales and Victoria, there was a large reduction in the number of people that were keeping distance from others. The next example is looking at people attending social gatherings. So we asked people about a number of activities, one of which was participating in social gatherings of 10 or more people in the last 4 weeks. The chart shows the proportion of people in Victoria and New South Wales who attended social gatherings of 10 or more people 1 or more times a week, various times. You see that in September 2020, this was very low and then gradually increased to April 2021. Before COVID-19, we also asked how many people attended social gatherings, how frequently. So in Victoria, 30% of people attended social gatherings regularly, 1 or more times a week before COVID, and 27 people of New South Wales attended social gatherings regularly. So from the chart, you can see that by April this year, the rates of attending social gatherings of this size had almost increased back to the levels they were before COVID. So no doubt by now they're back down a long way, probably to the September levels again. Okay, and the next slide I want to show is some data about the use of public transport. It shows the proportion of people in Victoria and New South Wales who use public transport 1 or more times a week. And again, we looked at this before COVID as well. So before COVID, 23% of people in Victoria reported using public transport regularly, and 29% of people in New South Wales. So you can see from the slide that public transport use decreased after COVID began, and there were extremely low rates during the Victorian lockdown, but it still hasn't come back up to the level, well, by April this year, it was not up to the level it was pre-pandemic. The last activity I wanted to show you was on working from home. This shows the proportion of people in Victoria and New South Wales with jobs who work from home 1 or more times a week during the period of COVID. Again, before COVID, only 20% of people in Victoria reported that they worked at home 1 or more times a week, and 25% of people in New South Wales. So you can see from this slide, there was a lot less reaction to various lockdowns on the working from home. So it has decreased gradually over time from September to April, but there are not the same bumps that we get with some of the other data in relation to restrictions. And the level was high as COVID started, but it hasn't decreased to pre-COVID levels. The next slide, I just wanted to give you a snapshot. This is a series of infographics publication that's available on the ABS website of some of the things we found in our household impacts of COVID survey, but also in our other data collections. Key things to come from it I took is people were generally very good at obeying the precautions they were supposed to be observing, keeping distances, avoiding public spaces, and cancelling social gatherings. Another big thing is we had the largest move from city to regional areas that have been recorded in 20 years in the September quarter. More screen time, more time with pets, and as you've probably seen, which is all over the TV, we panic bought at times. The last little bit of data that I thought would be relevant for this forum is a little bit of work we did on understanding electricity usage in Melbourne. So we looked at the patterns of electricity usage and found that there was an indicator of a trend of a high proportion of households staying home during the day as the crisis escalated through March and April 2020, and business electricity usage fell at the same time. And this usage was compared to the 2019 results, and so that it could be fairly conclusive that it was attributable to people staying home due to COVID. My last slide is a bit of a summary. As you all know, COVID had enormous impact on our lives in Australia, and it still is, with lockdowns continuing. The ABS moved quickly and developed a lot of new products, and probably faster than ABS has ever moved before. We pivoted to get these products delivered. What we did observe with behaviour is that some behaviour, such as panic buying, was very short-lived and goes up and down as restrictions come and go. Other things fluctuated a bit more slowly, but were really still associated with lockdowns. Things such as loneliness and anxiety, and concerns about being able to manage your own physical health fluctuated very much with the lockdown periods. But some things seem to be a bit more long-term. Working from home seems to be continuing. I know in the ABS, while we had facilities to work at home previously, they've increased now, and we can work from home a lot more often. Moving out of the city is more of a permanent move, and public transport use. I put a question mark over that. We haven't seen it decrease to pre-COVID levels. Whether it will, it's probably a question. I suspect if people continuing to work from home in the future, it will stay at a lower level than pre-COVID. So in summary, I guess a shock to the system, such as COVID or anything else, can rapidly change people's behaviour. These behaviour changes can be short-lived or they can be permanent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was a really great way to kick things off, and some of those trends definitely resonated for me as someone sitting in a spare room looking at a screen while the puppy that I purchased in lockdown is scratching on the door not far away. We'll get on to our next speakers in a second. Associate Professor Yolande Strengers is a digital sociologist and human-computer interaction scholar investigating the effects of digital, emerging and smart technologies. She leads the Energy Futures research at Monash University's Emerging Technologies Research Lab. Yolande has been conducting energy and smart technology research with Australian households for more than a decade. This year, she won the 2021 Women in AI Award for Innovation and the BNT Women Leading Tech Award for Research and Innovation for her research on smart home technology. And her latest co-authored book, The Smart Wife, has been featured in national and international media, including the New York Times. I think I've heard of that. Dr. Kari Dahlgren, her colleague, is a research fellow in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab also. Kari is a social anthropologist and ethnographer, and she's interested in the social and ethical aspects of energy production and consumption in Australia. Her previous research involved an in-depth ethnographic study of the Australian coal industry, for which she was awarded her PhD at the London School of Economics. Before they start, they are going to play you a brief video which shows some of the insights their work is generating, but also how those insights are collected. And I think you'll find it really interesting. So let's take a look before we hear from them.
I would like to think that I would do a little bit more research into it once, I guess, more options become available. If I bought a house or if I lived in a house, I would definitely want to do something with solar energy. And maybe I think you can sell back to the energy companies. But I was reading something this morning about getting fined for doing it. Not fined, but you have to pay for it or something. So that was a bit weird.
We do have, I think it's a Google Home Mini. My dad got one free somewhere, and he didn't want to use it, even though I set it up for him. And he made me take it. So it kind of sits in the kitchen, and it's only used when we tuck Taco in at night. She's gotten used to having music to go to bed. So if we say bedtime, she'll go to her bed, and then we have to play the music. So I'll just say, hey Google, play some music, and she'll have music playing in the night.
This is my son James, and he's a keen gamer, and he's playing a game today called Dota 2.
If I've been over to my daughter's and back, then I won't set it until 10 o'clock at night, or I'll set it up but I won't press the switch until 10 o'clock at night, and then I'll just come out and I'll put it on my phone to give me an alarm at 10 so I remember, and then in the morning I get up at 7, so I come out and just switch it off. I prefer to charge it on the slow charge because in the New Scientist, which I get, there was an article which said that it extends the life of your battery if you put it on low charge rather than high charge, fast charge. And because there's been the pandemic and everything, I haven't done any long driving, haven't been away for a holiday or anything using the car. So unless I'd have to, I wouldn't use a fast charger.
This is my primary office, pretty much. Working from home, a couple of work PCs, laser printer. Here's one of the first air purifiers, the little Breville one. Really good, it's a HEPA filter. Fully automatic. Haven't turned it on this weekend. So you can see the LEDs change colour based on what it has to do to clear out a room. It's quite nifty, it's really light, really quiet. A couple of other things I didn't mention was for winter, because I was going to be working home more from winter, got this nice little heat mat down there. Super low wattage, ridiculously super low wattage, it's very good. Just put your little feet on there and it keeps you very warm for the whole morning. And this is an electric blanket throw. The cats use it more than we do, but yeah, it's pretty good too. Again, super low power, but keeps me warm at the 3 in the morning if I'm up for work.
I think it's over to me. So thanks for the introduction, Dan, and thanks also for the invitation to speak to you all today and to be part of this conversation with you all. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that Kari and I are on today. We're in Melbourne and we come to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So the clips that you just saw, as Dan explained, are from our research project, Digital Energy Futures. And we really wanted to show you those videos just to sort of give you an insight into our research process and the research insights we'll be sharing with you today, but also to ground this conversation in everyday life, in people's stories and in consumer voices. So the project that we're talking about today with you is called Digital Energy Futures. It's a 3-year Australian Research Council linkage project with our partners Ausgrid, AusNet Services and ECA. So Kari and I are here with you today from the research team to talk to you, but there is also our colleagues at Monash, Professor Sarah Pink, Dr. Larissa Nichols and Rex Martin, who are also on this project with us. And our focus today is really on emerging digital and energy technology trends that are shaping future home life. Next slide, please. So the guiding question for this project is, how will people live in the future? And we're not just interested in how they will live with emerging energy technologies like batteries, battery storage, EVs, and all the kind of automation and various things that we typically talk about with the energy sector. We're also interested in how they will live in relation to new and emerging digital technologies, things like artificial intelligence, home robotics, consumer electronics, and the Internet of Things. And then we're interested in what that will mean for energy forecasting and for future demand. And that's really kind of the guiding principle of this project. Next slide, please. We're exploring these questions through a number of everyday practice domains where the majority of energy consumption occurs, but also where peak demand also occurs, and where we see changes in terms of home life. So we don't have time to go through all of these areas of activity and practice with you today, but we will be sharing some trends with you about air, play, and care. Next slide, thanks. The project began last year, and the focus of that time was to review industry visions for the future. So you may have seen this report that we put out in June last year. What we did was we reviewed a number of reports put out by the energy sector, but also the digital technology sectors in Australia and internationally. And we wanted to sort of compare those different industries' visions for the future and how they thought future home might look like, how the future home might look if mainstream predictions coming from those reports about digital technology and energy were to come true. So one of the things that we've been doing now is comparing those visions of those industry visions with consumers' own experiences and expectations for their future. Next slide, please. And that really is the basis of the new research that we've been doing that we're going to be releasing next week, and that we're sharing some preliminary insights with you today. And kind of flipping the question around in terms of not just, not going from what does the industry think the future is going to look like to how do people see their own futures unfolding? How do they see their own lives changing with digital and energy technologies? And we did that research with 72 households in considerable depth using ethnographic research techniques and involving a lot of video like you saw at the opening there, and identified 45 different trends about how future home life is emerging. You'll be able to see those in our report next week. Next slide, please. Contextualising all of this, as Dan pointed out at the beginning of this webinar, are of course the shocks that have really been seeing changes to home life, not just in the last year, although I know COVID is very much front of mind at the moment, but also longer term changes that have been starting to accelerate and impact on the home, particularly in relation to climate change impacts of bushfires, storms and heat waves, but also financial and economic changes in the types of economies that we're seeing in Australia and internationally, and also in the changing types of technologies and the rise of different types of technologies in relation to the home. Next slide, thanks. So what all that is meaning, and this has been going on again for longer than a year, but accelerating due to the shocks that I've been mentioning, is that we're expecting the home to do more and to be more to us. So we all can relate to this. The home is now a workplace, a school, a university, a cinema and gaming space. For some of us, it's a construction site, a gym, a hotel, and a restaurant. And it's catering for multiple people's needs, and often intergenerational needs as younger people stay at home, but also as older people age at home, and often in family spaces. What this means as well is an expansion of living space. So while the the actual physical dwelling of the home might not necessarily be expanding or enlarging, we are seeing that more areas, more rooms of the home are being used for a diverse range of activities. So bedrooms, attics, garages, sheds, pool cabanas, granny flats, outdoor kitchens, Airbnb rooms, they're all kind of involving new energy needs. They're being asked to kind of incorporate new and different types of devices to cater for these emerging needs for the home, and resulting in new energy demands in these different spaces. Next slide, thanks. So Marge, one of our participants, really sums this up nicely. She's talking here about her husband and how he's up in the shed during the morning and the afternoon, just coming down for snacks and lunch. He's got the oil heaters up there, but hey ho, you've got to do something. You can't sit in the house all the time. And in the summer on the hot days, it's too hot to go up to the shed. I think a reverse cycle, probably the idea keeps popping its little head up more and more. So Marge is reflecting on installing a reverse cycle air conditioner in the shed to cater for these new and expanding needs of the home. Next slide, thanks. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Kari, who's going to focus in on 3 disruptions to energy industry visions that we wanted to highlight to you today. Thanks, Kari.
Thanks, Yolande. As Yolande said, I'm going to be presenting on 3 disruptions that our research shows are of likely significance for the energy sector. There's many more that will be coming out in our report next week, but we focused on these 3 for this short presentation because our research, including that first stage review of industry reports that Yolande mentioned, shows that these issues tend to be overlooked by the energy sector, or they're not quite yet given the full consideration that our research is showing that they likely deserve. Next slide, please. So first are issues of air. The energy sector is still largely focused on household comfort as a matter of household heating and cooling. But our research showed that there's an emerging focus on providing clean and healthy air in the home, and that people really want to have greater control over household air quality and conditions beyond temperature. And people are looking to technologies to help them achieve this. So our research showed a growing interest in humidifiers and dehumidifiers, and they were adopted for a number of health reasons, or to control mold, particularly in rental properties. But of kind of particular importance were standalone air purifier units. So in our research, we identified that already about 1 in 10 households in our sample had them, and often they had more than 1 unit. And they were adopted for a number of reasons, but primarily as a result of the bushfire smoke from the 2019-2020 summer bushfires. But also people adopted them for allergies and hay fever and sort of general health concerns as well. And then as people purchased them for kind of one reason or another, they often found unexpected benefits that their increased use and uptake kind of provided, and then ended up purchasing more. So as, for example, one family purchased it for sort of a child's allergies on a doctor's advice, but found it was then really helpful in getting rid of those fishy cooking smells, and they've since purchased more units for the house. Slide. So the air purifier is also a good example of how industry visions assume that sort of smart digital technologies will be used to help energy management. But our research really showed that often the automated features that are installed in these devices aren't really about energy management at all, but potentially likely to increase peak demand. So for example, the smart features that are embedded in air purifiers are set to respond to air quality measurements. So they ramp up in the morning, or they ramp up during cooking dinner in the evening, or they ramp up on those hot, smoky days when air conditioners might also be on. So they're actually quite likely to add to peak demand in that sense. Our research also points to them becoming a new necessity, and thus being relatively inflexible as people are really privileging healthy and clean air in the home. And our research points to a real potential for air filtration to become installed into existing AC systems, which may encourage their greater and more regular usage. We already identified many that were replacing evaporative cooling systems in their homes with either ducted or split systems in order to have greater control over that household air and in response to the smoke from the bushfires. Slide, please. So here's a quote that exemplifies some of these research findings. So we bought 2 air purifiers, a smaller one for here and a bigger one for the lounge room, obviously for the bushfires. They both have auto mode, so we just leave them on. When it first comes on in the morning out of night mode, it'll fire up and do a heavy job at cleaning. It glows red and then comes back down to a nice soothing mood, and everyone feels safer. So this concept of sort of safety attached to healthy and clean air, I think, points to how this is likely to become kind of a new necessity. Next slide, please. So the next set of issues are around practices of care. And our research showed that practices of care really highlight how energy industry visions have a tendency to kind of overlook how external shocks can change seemingly stable practices, kind of framing of this webinar. Our research noted a real proliferation of digital devices for care, both for babies and children, and we recorded a special interest in caring for adults in the home, both through home-based healthcare and a desire by more to age at home. And this was partly in response to the pandemic and people's growing familiarity with remote healthcare that came as a result of lockdowns, and people's kind of increasing familiarity with the possibilities of technology to enable caring and aging at home. So we already recorded an increase in medical devices in the home and the likelihood that more energy use will shift from medical settings into the home, including sort of critical medical devices. COVID also led to a growth in pets, which Dr. Rogers pointed out. And our research showed a kind of continuing trend towards treating pets as family members with their own heating and cooling needs, and a growing number of digital devices that are used in their care, both specialized devices for pets like treat dispensers, but also other devices like from the video clip we started our presentation with, where the voice assistant was used to play music all night long to the dog. And we saw that COVID also really altered some household practices around hygiene and associated hot water use practices, sort of like showering and laundry. Next slide, please. So here's one quote that will describe one family's real changing routines because of COVID. So after work, I'm not allowed to touch or talk to the kids until I shower. My wife, she's very good with the way she's set up the rules because of COVID. When the kids are coming home, have a shower, all the things have to go in the washing machine, more washing up the dishes too. We usually wash clothes like once a week. Now it's about 7 or 8. Next slide. And finally, our research pointed to the importance of taking digital entertainment a bit more seriously. Energy industry visions tend to assume that the energy implications of consumer digital devices like TVs or video games are relatively small. However, our research shows that there's often auxiliary energy use that's associated with these activities, and it's likely to make them a bit more significant, particularly as the practices around them change in response to the changing use of the home for more and more things, as Yolande mentioned. So our research documented a proliferation and multiplication of digital devices, partly as a result of everyone living, working, and playing at home. So now every household member has to have their own device to be able to do all of these activities at the same time. So with all these individual devices, they're then often used in separate spaces of the home, which then each have their own heating and cooling needs. Our research also found that there are often other sort of devices associated with digital entertainment. I think the video gaming room is a really good example of this. We found that not only do people commonly have sort of either a couple of gaming consoles or a powerful gaming computer, but then they have multiple monitors, sometimes 3 or more, with special lights, special headphones, special keyboards that light up. And of course, no gaming room is considered complete without also having its own mini fridge for easy access to cold drinks. Next slide. And so here's another quote that illustrates how something that might seem like a relatively small energy use, a home gym, can kind of involve other devices as well. So, because I get bored when I'm on the rowing machine or the spin bike in my home gym in the garage, we got a little Apple TV set up there with a mini speaker and a monitor. And of course, as we've implied before, that this home gym in the garage is also potentially to have heating and cooling needs in the uninsulated space. So I'm now going to pass it on to Yolande to finish up. Thank you.
Next slide, thanks. Thanks, Kari. So we just wanted to conclude by acknowledging that we've given you a very kind of distinct set of trends here, but there are many others, and there's a lot of diversity in the research and the households that we visited, and also a lot of uncertainty about what the future might look like. And even though the trends are the things that we've emphasised today might look like they're associated with only high demand or high income homes, that wasn't necessarily the case. We are seeing these kinds of emerging digital technologies coming into all sorts of homes, but also significant, places where that isn't occurring as well. Pockets of either hardship or resistance or cultural diversity or other forms of diversity that we also need to be taking into account when we think about the future. And of course, that is very hard because diversity and accounting for all the different types of people in the world is a challenge, but certainly something we need to be considering. And we did also find some households who didn't want any smart technology, weren't interested in new automated features, and were very, very much resisting having new devices and things in their lives. So the question we have to ask ourselves here, and it's certainly one I think we can continue in this discussion today, is whose futures aren't being heard, whose voices aren't being heard here, and how do we better account for them in these understandings of what the future might hold. Last slide, please. Just wanted to give you a bit of a heads up on what's coming next in this project. So we are releasing our report on future home life next week, which will include many more emerging trends and also principles to help guide energy planning. We're tracking those trends through some future-oriented questions in Energy Consumers Australia's new Consumer Behaviour Survey, which will be coming out later this year. We're also sharing the stories. So the videos that you saw at the beginning, we're creating a video archive of many more stories. And we're also developing some documentary films from this research, which will emphasise different aspects of the future. We're developing scenarios that are going to be grounded in people's everyday lives and the kinds of practices you've heard about today. Developing a forecasting methodology that tries to take into account some of these social science insights and really get to that tricky issue of how we actually use these insights to better plan for the future, and also considering how these insights can be used in demand management innovation for load shifting and engagement opportunities. So that's it from us. I think there's one more slide, but we'll hand back over to Dan. Thank you very much.
We're actually going to go to Lynne Gallagher, our CEO now, and she's going to run the Q&A from here.
So I'm just going to make sure, is it better? Yeah, thanks. That's great. Thanks, Kira. I like people behind the scenes. So Helen, if you want to turn your video on, that's great. And we've got Kari, so that's great. Okay, well, look, thanks to our panelists. So now we've got quite a bit of time for Q&A, and obviously this is not as much fun or easy to do as live, face-to-face, but we'll do our best to take your questions. So I'm being reminded what you need to do is put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. If you're still having problems with screens or video or audio, let us know in the chat and we'll do our best if we can to fix it. But a reminder as well, this is being recorded and we'll share the slides. So put your questions in the Q&A and you can upvote, which helps me actually sort of direct the questions and see, as they say on Q&A, that's a comment, not a question. So, but the comments and questions we'll also make available after the event as well, so you can all see what people were saying. So before I go too much further, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of land on which I'm coming to you today, which is the Gallagher people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and the emerging future leaders. So while you get some time to think about your questions, I guess I just wanted to bookend, I guess, a few things that Dan's said in the introduction, but, you know, why is this our first webinar? And it won't surprise you that it is very much about consumer voices. It's about consumer activity. It's about consumer behaviour. And, you know, what we've heard from both our speakers using very different kinds of methodologies, if you like, but it really brings home what people are actually thinking, saying and doing
in this very different time, as we've also talked about and focused on. It's a pandemic, but let's not forget communities that have been impacted by bushfires, by storms. All of those things have ways of upending our lives and change the way that we engage in our homes, what we do at work. It's even changing how we think about family and who is in our family. When you have a 5-kilometre radius, it all of a sudden makes those connections both more important, but also limits who you can actually see on a sort of day-to-day basis. So that's why we started with consumer behaviour, and the last webinar in the series, we'll go to resilience is the next one, and then the last one is system design. So I just want to say a few things about what was in our mind in bringing the great work that ABS and Digital Energy Futures is doing in this space. And one of the things that we were thinking is, when we're focused on consumers and what they're doing and how the future of the energy system will evolve, it's not just an energy conversation, as you've just heard. There are parallels with the ABS and wanting to understand how the economy will evolve based on the impact on people's lives and their working behaviour. And it goes beyond, in their case, thinking about simple national accounts data. The other thing that we really wanted to share, and some of this has already come up in the Q&A or the observations people have made about gaps in evidence. What we know is the past isn't a good guide to the future. And so what you need is observation. You actually need to be collecting this information, whether it's in real time or, you know, in real context, however you want, whatever methodologies, and you probably need more than one methodology, but you need observation of what consumers are actually thinking, saying and doing. And this is what both the Digital Energy Futures and ABS have been doing. To go to the sort of future of the energy system question, when you have some understanding of what changes are happening in people's lives and their activities, then we need to revisit our thinking about whether the available energy system infrastructure is fit for purpose. Judgments will need to be made and scenarios tested about what changes might be temporary or what could be permanent. And when you have some idea about what the gaps are in how the energy system will function under what might be a new normal, there is a feedback loop where you need to engage with consumers. How much are they willing to adapt more or to change? Or how much will the system and assets and the way it's operated have to adapt and change? So that was really what was behind why we wanted to bring this particular research to you. So I'm just going to take a quick look at the Q&A, and then I'll direct some questions to the panel. But what I might do is, while I'm doing that, ask each of the panelists, maybe start with Helen and then go to Yolande and then Kari, what surprised you or was unexpected? You know, challenged your own assumptions in the surveys and the findings that you've talked about today.
Okay, I'll start. I had a quick one and then a slightly longer one. My first surprise was really when we first started these surveys in March last year, we got response rates we've never seen before. So people were responding to surveys, and this was all around the world for the first 3 or 4 months of the pandemic at rates they hadn't seen before, whether this was because everybody was bored at home or because they also saw that there was value in people understanding what was happening. So that was my first little one. The other one, which isn't quite energy related, is we were measuring mental health and at frequent points, and this hadn't been done before at such a frequent time frame, so longitudinally with the same participants. And we found that it was very, very volatile. So especially things like anxiety and restlessness were going up and down as lockdowns occurred. And however, and we saw that in the media, there was lots of people saying more people were ringing helplines, which is a good thing. the underlying trend, though, was also, there was a positive in that, because those changes were happening in things like nervousness and anxiety and restlessness, but in the really critical mental health things, which are things like feeling worthless and so sad that nothing can cheer you up, which are more of the indicators of suicidal intentions, they were fairly stable. So I guess that was what was surprising us, and some of the mental health people that were working, professionals working with us, found that data really useful in monitoring what was happening in the pandemic, and I guess reassuring that while there was a lot of use of helplines, they were not permanent shifts in people's mental health, but quite fixable.
Thanks, Helen. So Yolanda, Kari, do you want to have a go?
Sure. Well, what was surprising in this, I mean, I guess the new thing for me in this particular project, I mean, was probably around the kitchen, actually. And I got a little bit obsessed with kitchen appliances, I have to admit, because COVID has just, there's this cooking boom going on, and it's so many different appliances coming into people's homes. I almost wanted to buy an air fryer by the end of it. Everybody about their air fryer uses. I mean, I know that's not particularly necessarily significant for the energy sector in terms of the energy consumption from cooking, but it is something that we think now needs to be kept an eye on, because let me tell you, people are going crazy in their kitchens. The other one, though, I guess, was fridges. I was surprised how many there still are out there. And, I sort of thought we were on top of fridges, but I don't think we are. And, this sort of links to the expansion of the home, and fridges sort of moving into more and more spaces, just like heating and cooling. Although I've seen that, you've sort of seen that happening for some time. But, it's interesting with that expansion of living spaces, how many of those appliances that we sort of think of as relatively stable are multiplying or expanding into different parts. And while they might not be used all the time, I guess there's some concerning things, particularly with fridges being used in summer, which obviously links to peak demand. So there's a couple of things there that I thought, oh, okay, that's probably something to be keeping an eye on in appliance tracking trends.
Great, Kari?
Yeah, I would just I was thinking what Dr. Rogers was talking about, the increased response rates. One of the things that really surprised me, I think, when we started this research was how eager everyone was to share their lives. So I think, actually doing this kinds of consumer research, there's a lot of opportunities to do it, that people do want to share their routines and their practices because they do understand how important they are and are actually very interested in the energy system, even if they don't necessarily know the right words to use to describe, demand management or peak tariffs or, any of these things, but they do really care about it. And they do really care about doing their part. So I think that's just something to kind of keep in mind. That's really important for the sector and for research going forward.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to ask a particular question in a different way to the way it's been posed in the Q&A, because I think Helen may have some comments on this as well. I guess when people are going about their lives and they're doing the things that make their lives more comfortable, make them happy people, functioning families, the question really is, how much are they aware of how their own decisions, I guess, impact their costs, impact their energy bills, is one way of asking the question. But I'd like to broaden it out to Helen as well, which is, in a way, how much are people aware of the consequences of sort of what they're doing as well? We saw rises in retail sales in the pandemic as well, or at different points in the pandemic. Is there any insights from the ABS work, how much people are actually thinking about the broader consequences for them and others of what they're doing? So I might start with maybe Kari, start with you, and then go to Yolande, and then go to Helen.
Sure. I think one of the interesting things that we did in our research was to use load profiles with our participants. So we had 3 load profiles, usually from a kind of cold COVID lockdown day, a sort of hot, smoky summer day, and a kind of more, medium temperature regular day. And it was really interesting to go through those with households. And because you really had quite a diverse range of how people understood their energy use. And looking at the load profiles, I think in particular, some of this more surprising stuff was, I think, a lack of understanding around solar availability for solar PV households who you might expect to have a bit more knowledge about when their energy was available, but often would be quite surprised to see, how early in the afternoon their solar decreased, and a few participants really kind of come to mind that kind of stuck in my head, who, even if once learning that, kind of realized how difficult it would be to change their routines around it, and kind of gave up with the idea of it. So, sometimes it was a good thing, a good lesson about how knowledge doesn't necessarily translate to behavior.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does, but not always. Yeah.
Yolande.
I might just build on Kari's point there, and also address sort of Tim's comment at the same time, bump to the top, which is to say that energy data and those load profiles Kari talked about, they're influential and they're important in kind of getting people to think about their energy demand. But we also have to acknowledge all the other different kinds of data or information or inputs that are coming in to people as they make those kinds of decisions about how they're going to live and what they're going to do. I mean, the air purification one is a good one because it's a different form of data in the form of, signals on what's healthy air, what kind of particulates are in the air that people are increasingly paying attention to. And that's going to be more important to them than energy data. But there are many others, and they're not always in the form of like an actual data source. It could be that you stick your head out the window and you go, oh, it's a sunny day, I'm going to do the washing, or I'm going to do these other activities because, I'm getting some cues here from the weather. And so I guess this conversation about what data consumers want and need needs to be taken into consideration with all those other things that they're getting input from. And the way I would sort of think about it is, how can the energy sector sort of use those other data sources or be part of those other data sources in a way that kind of achieve the outcomes that the transition needs. So it's kind of a different way of looking at it, but it's a way of kind of incorporating all the various inputs that are coming into people's lives.
Yeah, that's great. Helen, one of the things I want to jump in and just say before you start is, I guess I'm not sure whether it came across in your slides, but what the surveys were doing is, as I understand it, was the same households over a number of months that were being surveyed. So I guess you had people who, were, through their participation were, coming to, reveal a lot of things about their lives. So in that context, as I said, to what extent were people aware of not just, the consequences of their own actions, but what it meant for other people as well? Yeah.
We were measuring. We had lots of participants. So we moved, people stayed in for I think it's 4 months for the first group. So it was about 4 months for each group of people that stayed in. I'm not sure that, I guess we had much to reflect on how people thought they might be influencing other people's lives. But it was clear for some of the questions we asked that people were, the fact that COVID was happening, they were thinking more about some aspects of their own lives. So we asked people, indicated that they were prioritising their own mental and physical health more. So probably at least 30% were prioritising physical health more than before. Mental health, people said they were prioritising that more as well. And part of that was seen in the community with the increase of people accessing services. So I think, I can't say that they were thinking about other people as much, but they were definitely saying those sorts of things, that there was a bit of people were spending more time on childcare. So some of these things were forced. So childcare, would example, was forced on a lot of people because children were at home. But others, maybe the change just made them think about what was happening more and their own lives. One of the things people told us is that liked the slower pace of life, and I think that slower pace of life enables people to think about themselves and others. There was people caring for people. I guess that's thinking about that. That does answer. I just thought about people said they were caring for people, and again that was partly forced as older people during the first lockdown tended not to go out to supermarkets, so there was more of family having to help get older people access to resources and go take trips to supermarkets for them. So I think does that.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. One of the other questions that people seem really interested in, and you may not know this from the surveys that you did last year, because I think you ran surveys until July, but one of the things people are interested in is, I guess, what the new normal is, and in that context, is there work that the ABS has done or is doing on what the sort of new normal working from the office days are? The specific question people have asked has said, you know, we read in the newspapers that there's, you know, people are looking at 2 to 3 days normal. Is there work that ABS is doing on that?
Well, the last of our COVID surveys does have that measure in again, but that we haven't released that yet. That was collected a couple of weeks ago. I mean, the data I showed here did show that people are still working from home. I mean, so we will continue to collect that in various surveys. The other surveys I'm involved in are collecting that to look at it long term. So, I mean, I would suspect it is part of a new normal. I know it definitely is at the ABS, anecdotally.
Yeah, anecdata is a great thing.
We used to have a sort of maximum of 1 day a week working at home, which is one of the reasons why we were able to pivot so quickly, because we were already working at home 1 day a week. We had video conferencing, we had all the facilities set up. Now we have expected to work in the office up to 4 days a fortnight. So that's a huge shift from sort of 1 day a week at home to potentially 3 days a week at home. And a lot of other office places are doing the same. It's obvious, setting up new standards.
Yeah, that's great. One of the other questions for Kari and Yolande is in the work you were doing with those households and families. One of the things you've drawn out is what the consequences are potentially for, we've underestimated increased energy use, but were there things that pointed to people either using less energy or being more conscious about using less energy?
Maybe I'll start. The thing that jumps into my mind was the opportunity that's presented by this increased working from home, particularly for the solar sponge. You know, a lot of people really celebrated the potential to, you know, do laundry in the morning, hang the washing out in the afternoon, and, you know, what being home enabled them to do that. So I think there's, you know, real opportunity to take advantage of that. Particularly people tended to prefer that kind of manual flexibility and that manual shifting of routines over sort of automation as the future. So I think that's one of the main points for really kind of matching, you know, the energy sector's needs onto new opportunities that COVID presented.
Yeah, I think, look, I guess we can speculate here, but ultimately we do sort of need some data from, you know, the kind of actual energy output of some devices to really know what would be going down and up. One of the things that we saw was an increasing sort of conversion across to electricity away from, say, petrol-powered tools and in some cases vehicles, and also away from gas, particularly in the kitchen. So while, I mean, I don't know what that means for sort of overall energy use, but there does seem to be this kind of moving shift towards electricity, which doesn't necessarily reduce the, energy consumption overall, but does sort of seem to be a shift in how people are accessing it. And then, I guess the other point to make is that there were, I think almost 20% of our sample were identified as being in energy hardship. And some of them were unemployed, and some of them had, very concerning issues around paying bills, and were really struggling to afford energy, and were making significant attempts to reduce their energy consumption in their home and go without some things they might want. So there's also that aspect that's going on as well, and that, we know many Australians are experiencing. So and particularly people living in poor quality housing, in rental properties, in insecure situations, that's probably even more so.
That's great. One of the things that's come up in different ways being asked in the Q&A is what new approaches or tools do decision makers need? Whether you're in Helen's case, she's informing largely, economic decision makers or national accounts decision makers, but also, or the economy decision makers, but also in energy. Because I guess what we don't know yet is how much of these things we're seeing are going to snap back, to use the Prime Minister's phrasing of a while ago, or how much is this the new normal. So I'm sort of interested as well, or people in the Q&A are interested in your sort of views about what do we need to change if we're going to need to look forward rather than looking back to the past to tell us what consumers are going to do. How are we going to go about that in the future? So I might start with maybe Yolanda, you start, and then Kari, and then Helen.
Thanks, Lynne. So, I think the most important thing is to really start thinking about how we integrate some of these social science and behavioural insights into planning. And I know the sector's already doing a lot of work on this as well, and thinking about how to do this. So, rather than sort of using historical trends of consumer behaviour and of past activity, thinking about how we can plan for and speculate about the future in a productive way that supports planning based on some of these emerging trends that we're seeing. And the other, I think, really critical aspect here, which Digital Energy Futures is doing, is to bring together the energy sector visions and the energy sector technologies with all these other changes that are going on in the home, many of which relate to new digital technologies. I know, there's also other economies that are coming in. We only briefly mentioned them today, things like gig economy and the platform economy that are delivering new services to the home, in the kitchen, which, as I said, I have a bit of a fascination with at the moment. There's all sorts of meal delivery services that are coming in, in various types of kits, but also in the form of Uber Eats. In the transport sector, there's massive changes going on there. And of course, that's all affecting the types of platforms as well that are available for energy trading and sharing. So there's all these kind of other things going on, and finding a way of incorporating stuff that traditionally wasn't in the purview of the energy industry into energy sector planning is the real challenge here as well, to think about how we do that.
Yeah, I think it's great. It's a great call to action for all those people on the Q&A and people who are participating as well. It's something we all need to reflect on, I think, and how we go about our role in the energy sector. So Kari, you as well?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that I think drives the point that Yolanda was making as well, the need to kind of keep, researching and to incorporate social science insights. So it's not just about, is it going to snap back or be like it is now, but what's the unexpected thing? Like, what's the next COVID? What's the next crisis? And we don't know that, right? So we need to have, flexibility kind of built into the system, and we need to keep kind of having that research and all these different stakeholders kind of in the room contributing to that, because we don't actually know what's coming next.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, one of the things, Helen, that I really was struck by in David Gruen's first big, the Australian statistician, first big speech in April 2020, so he'd been a statistician for 4 months, was how much he emphasised in that speech adaptability and measurement. So I wonder how much that's sort of part of, you know, the real change for the ABS?
I think that was. I think Dahlgren coming on board was an impact into us feeling free that we could adapt and could change and could do things quickly. I mean, people were putting up their hands left, right and centre to be part of something new when we moved to these quick surveys. More generally in the question you asked, I think I'd reiterate what Yolanda and Kari said about really incorporating understanding of human behaviour and wishes in what you're predicting for the future. I think, you know, you often get people coming up and saying, well, you know, you've got to do this or you've got to do that. We have to get people to do this or that. But by understanding what people want to do, it's more easy to predict and to predict the future and work with the population to meet their needs and understand what their needs are so that we can predict the future. I know the government is doing a bit of work in PM&C and the Behavioural Insights team to really start to work to understand people's behaviour and how they react to different things so that you know, services can be provided that meet people's needs, and be the same with energy so that we can, you know, predict how people are going to be using energy and how we can adapt the services for people.
Okay, that's great. So maybe I'll put you all on the spot because we're just about heading into wrap up time, and then I'm going to sort of make a few comments as well just about where people can go and find more information and what we're wanting people to do after the webinar to keep this conversation going. But I guess any last words from you, I guess maybe is a sort of call to action, the sort of real takeout. We've still got 130 people on the webinar, so clearly this is seen as a very important conversation and really important work. So maybe just some last words, letting you, you know, say what you want to say. So Kari, do you want to go first and then?
Sure. I would just say my call to action would be just to take consumers seriously. You know, they really are the ones who are making the impacts that are, you know, that the energy sector has to address. And that there is actually a lot of room, I think, to work with consumers in terms of, it's not just about predicting the future, not just about how are they going to act, but how can we also, you know, shift that. And, you know, what kind of programs, what kind of demand management programs, things like that will actually appeal to people at a level that's beyond just a sort of price incentive, but because people are really motivated by a lot of kind of ethical concerns around energy and the transition as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yolande?
Yeah, so I guess my sort of emphasis here is, you know, I think we have been talking about consumers for a long time, and there's, you know, there's certainly a lot of recognition in the industry that they're very important. It's, for me, it's more about a shift about how we think about them. You know, in the past, I think we've thought about them as, you know, people that we need to get on board with the energy sector vision for the future and embracing energy technologies in the way the energy industry thinks. And I think we're sort of in a transition in thinking about how we engage people and what it is that we're actually engaging them in. And we're probably all the way on the other flip side, where we're really starting with, okay, how do people live? What does that look like? How's that changing? And from there, how does the energy sector engage with that? So it's a kind of flip. Not just in getting people's perspectives on what they think about energy technologies, what they think about price signals, you know, and all the kind of stuff that we typically ask them about, but what the future and how to engage them in a future that involves everything that they might be doing in their home. And I guess it's a much bigger perspective and question, but it's so important because if we overlook the changes that are going on, you know, the air one's a really great example of that, that could change peak demand. It could change even what it is that we're trying to do demand management with and on. And so kind of coming back to those changes in everyday life and seeing how we can incorporate that into our consumer perspectives and plan from there, I think is the really critical challenge going forward. And it is hard. So, no.
Yeah, it is hard. If it was easy, we'd all be doing it already. Yeah. And last word from you, Helen, as well.
No, I think what the last two speakers have said is good. The only probably additional thing I'm thinking when you're looking at consumers and looking at their demands and what they want is really to look at the different motivations of different people within your consumer group. I know I've done quite a bit of work on motivation, and there are different things that motivate different people, and different people have different needs, and just making sure you, I guess, cater or investigate all different types of people in looking at the consumer behaviour and demand.
Okay. That's great. Well, that's a nice segue actually to me sort of, starting to bring us to a wrap up. So a lot of the questions that I didn't really pose to the team came to questions of really detail and methodology, and where were the people located you were surveying. In terms of digital energy futures, there's a new report out next week, which will be available, and then some of those questions I think will get picked up there. We've talked a lot about households, obviously, and Energy Consumers Australia also has a remit to think about small business. And the ABS also did a survey similarly with small business. So I'd invite people as well who are interested in the small business issues to go to the ABS website. And there's also material and information about that. So I guess my call to action to everybody as well is, I think we've heard some really valuable insights into how we need to go about this differently, how we need to engage with consumers to have their voice heard, to understand what they're really thinking and saying and doing, and not impose our own beliefs on what we think they should be thinking, saying and doing. But what I'm looking for as well is more than happy, and I think Dan's going to provide some details in a minute. We're interested in people sharing with us where they think the evidence gaps are as well, but also if you wanted to also share your thoughts on approaches that have been done elsewhere, sort of methodologies and tools and the ways that we may go about doing this, because this is also something for ECA to think about how we also undertake ongoing research ourselves. You've heard, or many of you know about our Energy Consumer Sentiment Survey, but we are now also going to do a behaviour survey, which we're doing with Digital Energy Futures team. But we're also looking ourselves at how we might adapt to have more deeper conversations, regular conversations with consumers in the same kind of way that you've heard from the speakers on the panel. So thoughts and ideas all welcome for us to think about, so that we're more adaptable and flexible in understanding what consumers are actually doing. So on that, I'll finish, and then I think my job is to hand over to Dan to wrap up. We're probably a few minutes early, but I think we're doing fine.
Thanks, Lynne. You're doing very well. We've got a few minutes to go. So we're coming to the end of our allotted time. I just wanted to thank all of our panelists today, Helen from the ABS and Yolande and Kari from the Digital Energy Futures team. I think we're really lucky to have their insights and their work as a starting point for what's been a terrific conversation already, and one that we hope will continue long after today's session ends, as Lynne has just suggested. The Digital Energy Futures team will be releasing their report next week, and we will be happy to provide you with a link to that when it happens. We'd also like to thank all of you for attending. A lot of competing demands for our time these days, and an extra 90 minutes on Zoom is probably not high on everybody's wish list. So the fact that so many of you from across the energy sector and beyond have turned out today is not something we take for granted. We really do appreciate it. This was webinar number 1 in our series of 3. The next webinar is on August the 12th, and that will continue the overall theme about framing the future through the shocks of 2020 This time we'll be talking about system resilience through the lens of a new study about the recovery effort following last year's East Gippsland bushfires and what that experience has been like for energy consumers. And we'll have strong representation on our panel from some of the network businesses who have direct experience of that as well. Our third and final webinar on September the 7th will be about system design and looking at some of the challenges of seeing all the possibilities and potentialities when we're imagining what the future energy system might look like. We hope that you'll join us for both of those, and we encourage you to register as soon as possible. We're already well over 100 attendees for each of those events, and there is unfortunately a cap on how many people we can host in these sessions. This session has been recorded, as we've told you throughout the day, and we'll be making the full recording available to all of you in the near future so that you can review it or share it with anyone who's unable to be here, and we encourage you to do that. My obligatory comms guy shout out is that we'd appreciate it if you'd consider following us on any of our various social channels or signing up for our monthly newsletter. We want to stay in touch and continue this conversation, you with us and each of us with each other. And as Lynne has mentioned, we've given you some framing questions at the start. If you didn't have time to engage with them or you want to do some thinking, we'd love to hear from you by email or via one of those social channels. That's really all I have to say at the moment. Thanks again, everybody, for coming, to all our panelists, and we hope to see you next month for webinar number 2.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody.